far from opposing science, most of the leading scientists of what became known as the scientific revolution were actually devout Christians whose biblical worldview supplied a rationale for their science. That's because the biblical worldview supplies a powerful foundation for science to develop and continue to flourish. For more than 100 years, many in our society, especially among the elites, have pushed the view that Christianity and the Bible were somehow obstacles to the rise of modern science. In its most extreme form, their view of history runs something like this.
After the end of the Roman Empire, Christianity plunged the world into the dark ages of superstition and tyranny. The progress of science stopped. The progress of technology stopped. Dogma ruled. Scientists were burned at the stake. It was war between science and religion. The world stayed in the Dark Ages right up until the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Paradise opened as thinkers rebelled against theocracy. Superstition was vanquished. Man was proclaimed the measure of all things. A scientific revolution gave birth to an age of perpetual progress.
Well, this narrative is sometimes known as the warfare thesis, or conflict thesis, the claim that Christianity, going back to the so-called Dark Ages, has been perpetually at war with science and has impeded its progress. The warfare thesis is pretty much claptrap, but it is damaging claptrap, even though historians no longer take it seriously. You can still find it in pop culture. Consider this clip from a cable TV series of just a few years ago.
The Earth is flat, the devil is real, and that is everything that we know. That's it? Congratulations, graduates!
Dark Ages, a Miracle Workers anthology, premieres January 28th.
So I'd like to respond to this, the warfare thesis, by making three basic points. Number one, the Middle Ages as a whole really wasn't the Dark Ages. The period was actually a time of great human progress in both the arts and sciences. It was during the Middle Ages that we saw the invention of eyeglasses. Some of us still wear those. The printing press, mechanical clocks, the extensive development of wind and water power, the wheelbarrow, crop rotation, Gothic architecture, chimneys, horseshoes, blast furnaces, paper mills, more elaborate compasses, polyphonic music, the development of universities. The list goes on and on. With regard to science in particular, one scholarly book claims, quote, "The scientists of the 12th century were daring, original, inventive, and above all determined to discover purely rational explanations of natural phenomena. Their intense interest in the natural world for its own sake, their habits of precise observation, and the high value they place on man as a rational being portend a new age in the history of scientific thought." So far from demonstrating the stopping of scientific, technological, and intellectual progress, the Middle Ages were in fact a seedbed of progress. Interestingly, C.S. Lewis was one of the early scholars who debunked the myth that the Middle Ages were just the Dark Ages. A second reason the warfare thesis is bunk is that the Christian church did not actually oppose the rise of science, either in the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. But wait, you might say, what about?
The Earth is flat.
Didn't Christians hold back science by championing a flat Earth? And didn't Columbus face opposition to his famous voyage of 1492 because Christians insisted that the Earth was flat? No, it didn't. In fact, the whole story about Christians insisting on a flat Earth is pretty much a hoax perpetrated primarily after Darwin by polemicists who were trying to promote the warfare thesis. If you'd like to learn more about the history of this myth, I'd suggest you read the book Inventing the Flat Earth, Columbus and Modern Historians by historian Jeffrey Burton Russell. Of course, There's also the story of the persecution of Galileo, except it turned out that Galileo's persecution or his problems were a lot more complicated than usually portrayed. He antagonized not just clergy, but scientists of his time and other intellectuals of his day. So the Galileo story is not just a story about his conflict with the Catholic Church. In any case, as a general rule, Christianity did not thwart the rise of science. The third reason the warfare thesis is wrong is that far from opposing science, most of the leading scientists of what became known as the scientific revolution, starting in the 16th century, were actually devout Christians whose biblical worldview supplied a rationale for their science. That's because the biblical worldview supplies a powerful foundation for science to develop and continue to flourish. This is a point I want to unpack really in the rest of my talk. To do that, I first want to go back to the majestic opening of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Many of us who've grown up in modern Western culture, I think, take this biblical account of creation for granted. We really shouldn't. For much of human history and in many human cultures, people did not believe that nature is the result of wisdom and purpose, of an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful creator. One of the best ways to understand the uniqueness of the biblical account is to read creation accounts from other cultures. In many of these accounts, the creation of the world is the result of accident and evil, not wisdom and foresight. In a Polynesian account, a creeping plant withers and rots. Out of the rot springs worms. Out of the worms spring men and women. In a Babylonian account, creation is the result of the gods killing their mother, plunging a spear into her, bursting her belly, and severing her inward parts, and clubbing her and smashing her skull. By contrast, the biblical account depicts creation as orderly and good. God declares his plans beforehand and then brings them into existence. Throughout the Bible, the original creation is seen as reflecting God's wisdom and power and goodness, not chaos and confusion and evil. In Psalm 19, David proclaims, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul writes that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And then in the book of Wisdom, we have, "But thou hast arranged all things by measure and number and weight." That was actually cited by a lot of medieval and other scientists to talk about the belief that God created things in a rational way that could be understood rationally. Or from Wisdom 13, "From the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator." This biblical belief that nature ultimately reflected the wisdom of a master creator supplied a foundation for modern science. If a supremely wise God created nature, we can expect nature to reflect his intelligent design, to act in orderly and rational ways that we as rational creatures can comprehend. Accordingly, early scientists thought they could unravel the mysteries of nature. It's precisely because they thought nature was the product of God's intelligent design that they expected nature to be orderly, purposeful, governed by laws rather than chaos, and understandable through human reason. And this expectation fueled the rise of natural science as we know it. C.S. Lewis put it succinctly in his book Miracles when he said, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator." The late sociologist Rodney Stark was one of many scholars who documented the connection between biblical theism and the rise of modern science. In chapter 2 of his book, For the Glory of God, he contends, quote, "Not only that there is no inherent conflict between religion and science, but that Christian theology was essential for the rise of science," unquote. Now, other historians of science aren't quite so emphatic, but they too emphasize how Christianity, grounded in the Bible, provided a fertile ground for science to grow. In the words of historian Peter Harrison, the Bible played a significant role in the scientific revolution and influenced the emergence of modern science in a variety of ways. Now, I realize that historians of science have a lot of different views about how influential or not the Bible in general and Christianity in particular were to the rise of science. Certainly other monotheistic traditions drawing from the Bible were also influential along with Christianity. Islam made many contributions to the rise of science and technology in the Middle Ages. Jewish scientists have made incredible contributions to the history of science. Of course, we have the Greeks and Romans before Christianity that actually did believe in, at least their philosophers believed in a type of orderly world that would give rise to types of science. Outside of Western monotheism, various Asian cultures contributed to the development of science and technology as well. So I'm not trying to argue here for Rodney Stark's maximalist positions that biblical theism is in the form of Christianity is the only way you can have modern science. I'm staking out a much more limited position. One, biblical theism was not an obstacle to the rise of science against the warfare thesis. Two, it provided a logical rationale for science. And three, for many early scientific pioneers, maybe even the majority, biblical theism provided a positive personal motivation for science. That's why modern natural science has roots in the Christian Middle Ages, and why, in the words of Rodney Stark, the leading scientific figures in the 16th and 17th century overwhelmingly were devout Christians who believed it their duty to comprehend God's handiwork. You can see the theological motivation for science that Stark is talking about in the countless leaders of the scientific revolution. You can see it in the works of polymath Isaac Newton, who declared in his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy that this most beautiful system of the sun, found in our solar system, could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. You can see the theological motivation for science in English naturalist John Ray, whose book, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, from 1691, is dedicated to showing how each part of nature reflects the infinite power and wisdom of God the Creator. In the words of Ray, the vast multitude of creatures, and those not only small but immensely great, the sun and moon and all the heavenly host are effects and proofs of his almighty power. The admirable contrivance of all and each of them, the adapting of all parts of the animals or all the parts of animals to their several uses, the provision that is made for their sustenance, and lastly, their mutual subserviency to each other, and unanimous conspiring to promote and carry on the public good, are evident demonstrations of his sovereign wisdom. Then we have this man, a final example, English chemist Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry. Boyle wrote that the wise author of nature has so excellently contrived the universe that the more clearly and particularly we discern this intricate construction of particularly chemistry, the more plainly we discern the admirable wisdom of the omniscient author of things. Boyle is interesting because in his last will and testament, when he's sort of leaving his final comments to his friends, he sent a message to his scientific colleagues in Britain's Royal Society, still one of the top scientific societies in the world, where he was wishing them a most happy success in their attempt to discover the true nature of the works of God, and praying that they and all other searchers into physical truths may cordially refer their attainments to the glory of the author of nature and the benefit of mankind. And he's talking about the science here, studying the works of God and searching into physical truths. For Boyle and many other early scientists, the ultimate purpose of science, of natural science, was indeed the glory of God. Rodney Stark studied the religious orientation of 52 of what he called early scientific stars. So really, some of the people generally recognized as being the most important early scientists who lived from 1543 to 1680. Over 3/5 of them, so over 60%, he classified not just as conventionally religious, but as devoutly religious, Christian actually, from their private and public writings. They really were devout in their belief in God. So that's 60%. Another third of these scientific stars of the scientific revolution were conventionally religious. They went through the motions at least. We don't know from their private writings of how much of a connection that had with what they were doing. Only 3.8% of these scientific stars were religious skeptics. Now, the biblical belief that nature displayed the intelligent design of a creator was the dominant view during the birth of modern science in the 16th and 17th century, and it helped modern science develop well into the centuries after that. But that was then. This is now. What about today? Does this biblical idea that nature reflects the intelligent design of an all-wise creator still have any relevance to the practice of science, or is it just an obstacle? Well, I would argue that it does. Even today, and this is an absolutely critical point, even today, scientific investigation proceeds because scientists assume for the sake of their research that what they're studying is orderly and reflects a rational purpose. In other words, scientists have to treat what they are studying as if it was intelligently designed in order to understand it. So when scientists look at a molecular machine inside us like the ATP synthase, the power plant of the cell, or the walking kinesin motor that transports molecular cargo inside our cells, or even the bacterial flagellum, the outboard motor that helps bacteria move. When scientists study these amazing molecular machines, they treat them as systems where the pieces work together for a purpose. In other words, they treat them as if they were engineered for some reason, as if they were designed. That's why they think they can understand them. This is the essence of much of modern scientific investigation. Even today, we think or we treat things as designed so we can understand them. And this is why a belief in intelligent design is not a science stopper. It's actually a science starter, even for those who may say otherwise. I came to appreciate this truth many years ago in a discussion with Professor Scott Minnick, a microbiologist at the University of Idaho. Minnick told me how he was attracted to the idea that things were intelligently designed as a scientist because he found it much more consistent with how he actually pursued science in his lab. To understand how a certain biological system works, he and his colleagues would assume that the biological system under study was designed to fulfill a particular purpose. They further assumed that each of the parts of the system played a helpful role in achieving the system's overall purpose. They did not treat the system under study as something cobbled together haphazardly or whose parts might be useless. In other words, these scientists treated the biological systems they were studying as if they were intelligently designed. And this assumption of design guided their investigations in the lab. The reality is that intelligent design is a guiding assumption for scientific research right now, even for those scientists who claim not to believe in it. Unfortunately, during the past 150 years, this foundational truth on which modern science rests, that nature is intelligible because it was designed, has become obscured largely due to the work of this guy, Charles Darwin. Darwin claimed that the appearance of design in nature was an illusion that was produced by an unguided process driven by random and accidental variations in nature. In his words, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. Although touted as a great breakthrough for science, in reality, Darwin's theory has repeatedly held back science by encouraging scientists to dismiss anything that can't be understood instead as the useless leftovers of the blind evolutionary process. It's sort of what one might call a Darwin of the gaps explanation, that if you can't understand it, you assume, well, we understand the Darwin process is blind and purposeless, has no higher end in view, and so we should have a lot of dead ends. And so we don't need to understand it. Maybe it has no purpose. Maybe it was an evolutionary dead end. Again, science is based on the idea that nature and her workings reflect a rational design. That's why we can hope to understand it. Darwin tried to undermine that idea. Science suffered as a result. In his book, The Discarded Image, C.S. Lewis wrote that nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions we ask her. I think Lewis's comment is profound. The answers we receive from nature are dictated by the questions we ask, and the questions we ask are shaped by the assumptions and expectations of the scientific theories we embrace. If we assume that nature is the product of blind and accidental processes, then that's going to shape the questions we seek to ask nature. And those questions will limit what we actually discover. Nowhere is this more true than in the field of Darwinian evolution itself, which is based on the inviolable assumption that everything in biology must be the result of unguided material causes. Over the past century and a half, this assumption has undoubtedly inspired some interesting research questions and some scientific advances. At the same time, it also has undoubtedly discouraged and delayed many other important research questions. Witness the unhelpful Darwinian preoccupation with vestigial organs. Time and again, biological features we don't fully understand have been dismissed by advocates of Darwinian evolution as non-functional leftovers from a blind evolutionary process. Time and again, researchers who eventually bothered to look discovered that such supposedly vestigial features, the appendix and tonsils, to name two, actually perform important biological functions. The evidence of function was there all along, but scientists were discouraged by the existing paradigm from asking the questions that would elicit the evidence. More recently, one of the biggest blunders in the history of modern biology may turn out to be the belief that the human genome is riddled with so-called junk DNA. Random mutations in protein-coding DNA are supposed to drive Darwinian evolution. So when it was discovered that the vast majority of DNA does not code for proteins, many leading Darwinists jumped to the conclusion that non-protein coding DNA must be mere junk left over from the evolutionary process, just like some vestigial organs. Not only that, leading evolutionists such as Oxford University Richard Dawkins championed junk DNA, so-called junk DNA, as proof positive that human beings were the result of an unguided evolutionary process rather than intentional design. However, when scientists finally started to look closely at so-called junk DNA, non-coding DNA, they were shocked. Reality did not correspond to their ideological Darwinist assumptions. Starting with the ENCODE project around 2007, there has been a flood, just a flood of research that really overturns what this is, showing that so-called junk DNA actually perform important biological functions. In the words of the late biologist Jonathan Wells, far from consisting mainly of junk that provides evidence against intelligent design, our genome is increasingly revealing itself to be a multidimensional, integrated system in which non-protein coding DNA performs a wide variety of functions. Again, the evidence for functionality was always there for us to discover, for us to ask about, to find. But the evidence was not forthcoming because few people were asking the right questions because they were blinded by the Darwinian paradigm that nature is riddled with non-design. Over the past few years, a growing number of scientists have become disillusioned at the accumulating scientific failures of theories like Darwinism that don't seem to explain what we actually see in nature. So this is just a sample of people. So Robert Laughlin is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at Stanford University. He's gone so far as to declare that evolution by natural selection has lately come to function more as an anti-theory, called upon to cover up embarrassing experimental shortcomings and legitimize findings that are at best questionable and at worst not even wrong. Philip Skell was a member of the National Academy of Sciences here in the US. He was the emeritus Evan Pugh Professor of Chemistry at Penn State. He declared that Darwinian evolution has functioned more as a philosophical belief system than as a testable scientific hypothesis. This quasi-religious function of the theory is why many scientists make public statements about the theory that they would not defend privately to other scientists. Russell Carlson is Emeritus Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at the University of Georgia, one of America's top research universities. He says, science needs to be guided by objective evaluation of the evidence, and scientists should not allow their thinking to be arbitrarily restricted by dogmatic ideas. We need scientists who think outside the Darwinian box. David Glercher is a professor of computer science at Yale University. He's known for his breakthroughs in parallel computing. He's widely credited with foreseeing the World Wide Web, and he's one of the inspirations for the internet programming language Java. In 2019, he announced that he no longer accepts Darwinism to explain the major innovations in the history of life. Like so many others, he wrote, "I grew up with Darwin's theory and had always believed it was true. Yet there are many reasons to doubt whether Darwin can answer the hard questions and explain the big picture, not the fine-tuning of existing species, but the emergence of new ones. The origin of species is exactly what Darwin cannot explain. But it's not just individual scientists who are raising questions about traditional Darwinian theory. I mentioned earlier something about the Royal Society, which is still one of the world's preeminent scientific societies. Sir Isaac Newton was a member years ago. It's in the United Kingdom. Its members are, again, have included many of the most top scientists, certainly in Europe and the UK. And after Newton, say, Sir Francis Crick, co-discovered the structure of DNA, was a member. In 2016, the Royal Society convened a conference to try to find a new theory of evolution because traditional Darwinian theory was failing to explain the major changes in the history of life. But not only are more scientists questioning traditional Darwinism, a growing number are re-embracing the idea that nature reflects intelligent design. Charles Townes was another Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He chaired NASA's Science Advisory Committee for the Apollo moon landing program. In a 2005 interview, he said this: "Intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way. If the laws of physics weren't just the way they are, we couldn't be here at all." Guillermo Gonzalez is an astronomer. His research has been featured in the journal Science, Nature, and on the cover of Scientific American. He's co-author of a major astronomy textbook published by Cambridge University Press. He's co-developer of the idea that there is a galactic habitable zone in our galaxy that is predisposed for the development of life. He thinks there is evidence that our planet was fine-tuned for the existence of life, that it was intelligently designed to make life possible. Marcos Eberlin is a world-renowned chemist at Mackenzie University in Brazil. He's a member of Brazil's National Academy of Sciences. He is also president of Brazil's Intelligent Design Scientific Society. He has written a book titled Foresight that explores how nature is intelligently designed. This book was endorsed by multiple Nobel Prize-winning scientists. Not all of those actually embraced intelligent design themselves, but they thought that the issues raised by Eberlin's book were significant enough that they were willing to endorse it. One of these Nobel laureates later went further. His name is Brian Josephson, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics. He's a fellow of the Royal Society, again, and emeritus professor of physics at Cambridge University. In 2021, he declared, "Far from being an unscientific claim, intelligent design is valid science." Scientists and scientific groups that support the idea that nature is intelligently designed and that has good repercussions for science can now be found throughout Europe, in South America, in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Articles by intelligent design sympathetic scientists are appearing in mainstream peer-reviewed science journals. One example is an article in 2020 in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, a top journal in the biological sciences, co-authored by Professor Ola Höster at Stockholm University. This article explicitly discusses design and design detection as a way of understanding the fine-tuning of biological systems. Now, I think that the idea of intelligent design is gaining traction once again, particularly in the life sciences, because it helps us make sense of the growing number of things that just don't fit within a paradigm of unintelligent materialism. For example, we now know at the base of life is biological information. We see this in DNA, which functions as a code directing many aspects of an organism's development, just like software. Codes and information systems are hallmarks of mind, of intelligent design, not unguided accidental processes. Intelligent design, I think, also helps us understand why the universe, to quote Galileo, is written in mathematical language. The fact that we can understand the universe mathematically and even make predictions about the material world based on mathematics has been a vexing puzzle for the modern materialist. After all, why should there be such a correspondence between math and nature? To echo another Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Eugene Wigner, if one assumes a materialist conception of nature, it seems positively unreasonable for mathematics to be so effective in the natural sciences. But it's perfectly reasonable if one sees nature as reflecting intelligent design. Nature is mathematical because it reflects the mind of its maker. Intelligent design also helps us better appreciate the nested layers of purpose in our universe that make our lives possible. One of my friends and colleagues at Discovery Institute is Australian, New Zealand, and British. Comes from, I don't ever know how to describe him, because he started out in Britain, then he ended up in Australia and New Zealand, and does research actually, I think, in Burma. So we'll just say, my friend, biologist Michael Denton. Perhaps more than anyone else, he helped me understand how intelligent design isn't just found in complex biological adaptations like the molecular machines inside us. It's also seen in the countless preconditions in nature, preconditions that are required for each of us, for all of us, and for our civilization to exist at all. Let's take just one example, and this is just one example, and I'm only going to just give you this big overview. Everything I say here, you could just go on and plumb deeper and deeper, but that's the existence and use of fire, which could almost be called the miracle of fire. The use of fire is so much a part of human culture that most of us probably don't give it a second thought. But the mastery of fire was one of the greatest turning points in human history. It was the mastery of fire that allowed the development of technologies on which all of our lives depend. Fire enabled ceramics, which led to the production of pottery, pipes, bricks, and tiles. Fire led to the creation of glass, which produced glassware, windows, plate glass mirrors, and eyeglasses. Fire led to the rise of metallurgy, which allowed us to transform raw ore containing copper, iron, and other metals into utensils, weapons, and tools. Metallurgy, in turn, led to one invention after another: nails, steam turbines, internal combustion engines, automobiles, telegraphs and telephones, computer chips. In short, humanity's mastery of fire was the initial domino that produced a succession of innovations leading to the world we know today. What I just said about the importance of fire is actually not especially controversial. But what Michael Denton helped me understand is that the revolutionary impact of fire is only a small part of the story. In fact, it's the end part of the story. What's usually not talked about is what I'm going to talk about now, which I'm getting from Michael Denton. And in fact, he wrote, we've done, one of my documentaries actually is called Firemaker, and it's on this topic. And there's also a short book called Firemaker by Michael Denton that unpacks this in much more scientific depth. In order for our planet to fully realize the life-giving powers of fire, a multitude of precise and exacting preconditions had to be fulfilled in nature. Here are just a few. First, our planet needed the right kind of atmosphere, one that permits both the existence of fire and the existence of a biological creature capable of using it. That's harder than you might think. But to get the right kind of atmosphere, our planet has to be just the right size. Only planets of the right size can possess an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which is required if you want to have both respiration and combustion. But there's more. In order to harness the most important benefits of fire, our planet needed to have the right kind of fuel that can generate fires with sufficient heat. Working with iron typically requires heat in excess of 1,200 degrees Celsius. You can't achieve or maintain that sort of heat simply by burning grass or branches. You need coal or charcoal or something equivalent. But the existence of such fuels depend on the flourishing of large woody plants. Those plants in turn are made possible by a molecule known as lignin. According to Denton, without lignin there would be no woody plants, no wood, no coal, no charcoal, no fire, no pottery, and certainly no iron, and probably no other metals or metallurgy. But even once you have the right kind of fuel, that's still not enough. You need a living being capable of making and using fire. And to be able to do that, the living being must have a body of just the right size and design. You also need creatures with muscles of the right strength. A fire-making creature also requires nerves that can transmit messages with the right speed. And he goes into all the depth about why that's the case, because actually creating and maintaining a fire requires a lot of things to do. But it's not enough to merely have fast nerve conduction. A creature that hopes to utilize fire needs to have nerves that are the right diameter. If our nerve fibers were the size of those in invertebrates, for example, our nerve cords couldn't fit inside our bodies. Finally, for the use of fire to result in new technologies, nature had to be seeded beforehand with compounds and elements with powers that could be unlocked by fire. Such materials don't have to exist on our planet, but for some reason on our planet they do, in abundance. According to Denton, it's as if the materials of nature themselves were prepared beforehand to facilitate our technological advancement. It's not a new thought. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-founder with Charles Darwin of the modern theory of evolution by natural selection, had this thought too, because unlike Darwin, Wallace believed that evolution had been guided to produce animals like human beings and to produce a world where humans could flourish. In his book, near the end of his life, The World of Life, Wallace wrote extensively about humans' technological civilization depends on the fact that our planet was preceded with metals like iron and copper. In his words, without iron and copper, an effective steam engine could not have been constructed. Our whole vast system of machinery could never have come into existence. Wallace pointed out that science itself is dependent on the natural capacities pre-built into the chemical elements and compounds from which our world is constructed. Consider the chemical compounds that make possible the production of clear glass. In the words of Wallace, without the use of clear glass in bottles, tubes, etc., chemistry could hardly exist, while astronomy could not have advanced beyond the stage to which it had been brought by Copernicus and Kepler. It rendered possible the microscope, the telescope, and the spectroscope, three instruments without which neither the starry heavens nor the myriads of life forms would have had their inner mysteries laid open to us. Wallace did not think that the existence on our planet of the materials necessary for modern technology was an accident. According to him, these materials pointed to a cause beyond nature, to an all-pervading mind. I would argue that intelligent design helps us make sense of the world as it actually exists. A world that exhibits evidence of foresight and planning by a master creator at every level of nature. As a result, a belief in design not only provides a solid foundation for science, it also inspires us to do better science. And this is true whether one is an atheist or a Christian. For even scientists who think they reject the intelligent design of nature today are forced to treat nature as if it is intelligently designed in order to understand its inner workings. Thank you.